that would be great.
Okay, I'm recording.
Let me know when I should get started.
All right, I think looks like we're up to 18 now. So I think that's probably, we might get one or two more people joining in a minute or two, but I think we're good to start.
All right. So today, as the title slide tells you, is going to be the whirlwind of evolution. This is essentially to give you guys a broad scale overview of general concepts in evolutionary biology, which may be applicable to your systems, and help try and clear up some well-known standard misconceptions. I am a completely informal person, so I am totally okay with you stopping and interrupting me and asking questions along the way. Although if I don't have slides prepared for things, this may involve a certain amount of me Googling for images while I share that screen with you while I talk. Also, in particular, any of the facilitators who want to jump in and clarify something, feel free to do so. I think that's going to be most applicable to Charles or Anya, but anyone should feel free.
And you know me, I always feel free.
Yes, but some people feel more comfortable if I specify this ahead of time.
Yep.
Right. So evolution is a general process, and the overall algorithm of it fundamentally depends on 4 specific things. So for us to have evolution, we need to have some degree of variation in the population. Shockingly, not all organisms are completely identical copies of all other organisms. This is true both within populations, so some of these fish are going to be slightly different than others even within the same species. And it's also true across populations. This fish is not a coral. So there's variation across species, there's variation within species. That variation is a required part for us to have evolution, because we're not going to get change over time within populations if there's no variation to work from. This also requires some degree of inheritance. So these puppies, on average, are going to be more similar to their parents than they are to other randomly selected dogs from the population. Now, it's possible to have variation that isn't inherited. There's variation that's induced by the environment, and this is important for what's going on in a population, but it doesn't lead to change over long periods of time, because if all variation is induced by the environment, then it doesn't matter which organisms are reproducing. They're not going to make a set of new organisms that are more like them than like the rest of the population if all of that variation isn't due to the specifics of those organisms, but due to outside factors instead. We also need some degree of selection. Now, this is specific for evolution by natural selection. There are forms of evolution that are not natural selection. We're going to go over some of those differences, but not all organisms are equally good at dealing with all particular environments. So some of these unfortunate giraffes are a little too short. They don't actually get the food they need, and so they don't make it into the next generation's gene pool. Now, that can be because of a couple of different reasons. It could be that they aren't surviving as well, or it could be that they're not attracting mates as well. In sexually reproducing organisms, the ability to attract a mate is an important part of the selective environment. And as long as we have those 3 things, if these populations persist over long enough periods of time, evolution by natural selection is going to be an inevitable consequence of this system. Now, evolution is a process that we refer to frequently as substrate neutral. This is a quote from Daniel Dennett, and it's important to recognize that nothing that we just talked about depends on nucleic acids like DNA. evolution will happen in a lot of systems outside of biology. So of particular relevance to this group, we can absolutely get evolution in computational systems like Avida and NABE and several others that we could talk about. We also have evolution in other systems like culture or language. As long as we have this variation and some portion of that variation is heritable across generations, and there's some selection, so some forms do better than others, we will end up with evolution by natural selection. It's important for our scientific purposes to point out that the evolution that we have going on inside these computational systems isn't actually a simulation of evolution. It's actually an instance of evolution. It's just an instance that is outside of biology. Now, one of the things that is inherent with what we're talking about in terms of evolution in as far as scientific understandings of it go, is that evolution is a thing that happens at the population level. And so this is an example that you've probably heard something about before, maybe in a high school biology class. It's well known that within the United Kingdom, there was this species of moth referred to as the peppered moth, that the population as a whole got steadily darker over the course of the Industrial Revolution. And there are a couple of different ways this could happen. So in panel A, we're looking here that the proportion of the light and the dark moths is changing over time. And the dark moths are better suited to this environment, and so they're becoming more numerous. Whereas in panel B, there's almost no variation within a population at any given time point, but all of them are getting darker in lockstep over time. Now, scientifically, panel A is much more plausible, and that's actually what happened in this particular case. We had two different color varieties within this species, and the darker population was better suited to this new environment, and so spread and became predominant within this moth population. A lot of students, though, will come into this with kind of an intuitive understanding that it's more along the lines of panel B, that there's some innate feature of the species, and all the organisms are kind of reflecting that innate nature, and it's that innate nature that changes over time. This is a widespread misconception, and it's important to point out that we really do depend on this variation within the population, and organisms that are better suited to a particular environment are the ones that are going to reproduce and have more offspring, and therefore that will cause the population to more closely resemble the forms that are doing better in that particular environment. Now, a lot of our evolutionary dynamics are underscored by this concept of fitness. And since I have now been talking for about 10 minutes, I'm gonna poll you guys and get some sense of what do you guys even think we're talking about when we discuss fitness in an evolutionary context?
How well things survive and reproduce, especially in comparison to each other.
Okay, so this is a statement that this is Jamie piping in with the idea that it's all a measure of how well organisms survive and reproduce. And that's actually really fundamentally important. So in everyday speech, fitness has a lot to do with strength and endurance and things like that. Fitness has nothing to do with that in terms of an evolutionary approach. We care about whether organisms are able to survive, we care about whether they're able to find a mate, and we care about whether they're able to successfully rear offspring. And so there are many different ways of being fit. There are organisms that take very different approaches, but still do quite well in their environment. Now, fitness is another thing that for those of you who have taken some of the higher level CS classes, you may have run into the computer science version of fitness, which is often a little bit different than the biological concept of fitness. So in evolution and in biology as a whole, we tend to notice that organisms are able to reproduce. We measure this reproduction, and we use those measurements of reproduction and survival to calculate fitness. In a lot of computational systems, we will have something that's an explicit fitness function, where we assign fitness to organisms based on some criteria. And then we use that fitness value to figure out which organisms are going to reproduce. These two different ways of approaching fitness do not always precisely correlate with each other. And so there are some findings from one field that don't apply to the other because fitness means somewhat different things in these two different contexts. So because of my background as a biologist, I am telling you everything in terms of biology. You should treat all of that with a slight asterisk of check to see if it's different in your computer science application. Is that a fair summary, Charles?
I was muted there. Yes. So I think it's important that it's not a prevalent concept in computer science about fitness. It's more of evolutionary computation in particular. But it's very much fitness in evolutionary computation. We assign based off of who we want to survive, right? We choose who we want to make survive, give them a higher fitness, and then enforce this idea of that they have higher fitness, as opposed to in biology where we measure, how well an organism is surviving, or rather its offspring, and then it's fitness is just a measurement. Absolutely.
All right. So because we've discussed here slightly higher and lower fitness, important caveat up front. I am taking the position that higher fitness means that the organism is more likely to survive and reproduce. Not everyone in evolutionary computation uses this formulation. There are some people who view the best fitness is the globally optimal solution, and you are measuring how different any individual is from that global optimum. So they're looking for lower fitness is better because you're looking for deviations. I find this completely counterintuitive and very different from anything we deal with in biology. So I'm telling you up front, for the purposes of today, higher fitness is better. And that's just the way we're going to go through with things. So the general concept of adaptive landscapes underlies a lot of how we even discuss changes in populations occur and spread through a population. There are a lot of different ways of formulating an adaptive landscape. I am choosing what I think is the easiest of the ways to explain. I am happy to go into more complicated detail if someone really wants to know. The idea here is we're going to imagine we have this three-dimensional surface, and the X and the Y axes are each a trait of interest. So we can imagine here that if we were thinking in terms of animals, this might be length of limb, and this might be running speed. And for every combination of those two traits, we have some fitness value associated with it. That's the vertical dimension here. So how high or low that is on this landscape. So any individual in the population is going to exist at a single point somewhere in this landscape. They have some value for trait 1, they have some value for trait 2, and the combination of those two values gives them a fitness value. This, incidentally, is a gross simplification. Nothing has only two axes that matter in terms of fitness. And this can cause problems because real landscapes are n-dimensional, and geometry beyond 3 dimensions does not work the same way it does in 3-dimensional heuristics. But we still talk about this all the time. So in order to be able to understand how people are referring to things or what a paper even means, we need to explain what this metaphor even is. So we have some individual who has this combination of traits, and that gives them a fitness score. A population that is a group of other organisms of the same species that are all in the same environment and maybe part of the same gene pool are going to exist as a cloud of points, because not all of them are going to be perfectly identical on each of these 2 traits. That's the variation component that we were talking about earlier. Now, because these individuals have different fitness, there is selection that's going on. The organisms that have higher fitness are more likely to survive, and they're more likely to reproduce. So when this population undergoes reproduction, we're going to have a resulting population that more closely resembles the high fitness individuals in the population at the previous time step. And this whole process will iterate, and the cloud of points will shift across this landscape until it ends up clustered at a peak somewhere in this landscape. Now, there's a lot of digital ink that's been spilled debating whether these peaks are real things and whether they prevent individuals from moving to a different peak. But this is what we're talking about when you encounter discussions of things like an adaptive landscape, hill climbing, things like that. And this is how a tremendous number of computational people will discuss changes in a population, and so it's worth understanding what they mean about it. All right, so now we're going to get into some common misconceptions in evolution and why they aren't this way. So you'll notice I have a bunch of links frequently to webcomics on here because there are a few particular web cartoonists who do a very good job of explaining scientific concepts. This is Zach Wienersmith of Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal. He does a few of them. So one common misconception is that organisms get the mutations that they need in order to survive. So this underlies a general concept that's referred to as teleology, that evolution is this goal-directed process of trying to get to a better end state. And part of the reason why people think this is that the scientific community uses unfortunate shorthand when they talk about things that can lead itself to this misconception. We often talk about organisms getting the mutations they need, but that's not because the organism is choosing to mutate or choosing to adapt. Rather, as we went through with that Avita Ed exercise weeks ago, organisms are producing mutant offspring all the time. And some of those mutations are beneficial, and some of them are harmful, and some of them don't matter at all. When the environment changes, that changes which of these mutations are going to be beneficial and which ones are not. And when a set of mutations is beneficial, selection will act to make the organisms that happen to get those mutations become more frequent in the population because they have a higher fitness, they'll survive and reproduce better, and so the population will come to resemble them instead. So I have just got notice that a few things are showing up in the chat. Okay. So Jamie's asking about a species of pig which evolved to kill itself because females like pigs with longer tusks. Like Anya, I do not know of this particular example, But it is absolutely true that there are times when selection will be pushing a population in one particular direction, and then selection on another trait will push it in another way. So the example we're going to talk about to explain this whole thing here is dealing with peafowl. So peacocks, incidentally, are the males of peafowl. Peahens are the females. And so the males have these ridiculous tails, which are huge and showy and kind of attractive, but they also cause problems for the males. By having this huge elaborate tail, they're much less capable of flight because they have these iridescent feathers. They are much more visible to predators. So their selection being imposed by the females to have these more and more elaborate tails, because the males with more elaborate tails are better able to attract the females and therefore have more offspring because of that. But the males with the more elaborate tails are also more likely to die. And it turns out death is a pretty strong selective force. So you have death removing the males that have too elaborate tails and cannot survive because of it. But you have pressure induced by the females causing them to be favored for having more elaborate tails. And you end up with this equilibrium where the showiness and length of the tails is not changing on average from one generation to another. So you get this balance from multiple different selective forces here. We have similar sorts of things happening across a wide variety of species. Frequently, this is going to be a balance between things that are beneficial for attracting mates versus things that are beneficial for not being killed by predators. And in general, although not always, it tends to be the males who are subjected to these forces. In most sexually reproducing species, but again, not all, females tend to be choosier in reproduction than males do, because females have a higher investment in particular offspring. And in general, female reproductive success is more limited by their access to resources in the environment, whereas male reproductive success is more limited by access to females. So it's more often the case that females impose these sorts of sexual selection practices on males, which means that in many species which are referred to as dimorphic, that is, males and females have somewhat different appearance or size or shape or things like that, the females are more likely to survive. They generally are better camouflaged. They're better adapted for the resource needs of that environment. The males tend to be showier, more brightly colored, have more easily identifiable vocalizations, have these big elaborate ornamentations that are not useful for their own ability to survive, but are useful for their ability to compete for and gain access to females. Anya, was I sufficiently careful in my wording on that?
I think the only thing I would include is there's exceptions to everything.
Yes, there absolutely are. And we can give you plenty of examples of those things. So, for instance, there are actually a number of fish species where the males do more care of offspring than the females do. And in those species, the males actually tend to be more choosy in which females they mate with than the females are in choosing males. And there are a number of other species we can talk about. The jaconda is an odd wading bird in the Amazon that has a similar sort of sexual role reversal because there are such extreme environmental resource requirements for the females to be able to produce eggs that the females have to spend all of their time getting those resources, and the males are competing to get access to the females in a way that's essentially inverted from typical. This is often referred to in the literature as sex role reversal, which has a very specific meaning in biology that is not at all what you could easily misconstrue it to be in terms of sociology. All right, so there is this general notion that organisms get the mutations they need in order to survive. There's some sort of goal-directed thing here. That's not what's going on. Fundamentally, organisms are getting mutations as an inevitable result of trying to copy their genetic material, and some of those mutations happen to be beneficial in a particular environment. All right, so we also have this idea that strongest is best. When we talk about survival of the fittest, what we mean is that this is inevitably going to select for strong, fast organisms with a lot of endurance. This is not at all what we're actually talking about. Fitness in this context is defined by this ability to both survive and reproduce. So the fittest organisms may actually be physically not very impressive, but they have some sort of chemical or vocal cue that is really attractive. Or maybe they're just better at not being eaten. And so you can have these things that manage to survive long periods of time because nothing ever eats them. And therefore they become fit in that particular environment. And the population shifts over many generations to more closely resemble those organisms. So there's also this concept that there are organisms that have stopped evolving. And so you'll hear discussions of living fossils, or how we've had crocodiles or coelacanths or horseshoe crabs for millions of years and they haven't changed. So because, again, this is better if it's a little bit of interaction, why is it not the case that alligators or horseshoe crabs or coelacanths have not changed for millions of years? Why is that wrong? As a warning, your screens give me your names, and so I am fully capable of calling on someone to ask.
Let's see, there's 20 people. You could just take a 20-sided die.
I do have dice in the room, so that is an option. I do also have the ability to pull a random number generator from the internet. So maybe I will do that. And I'm going to re-roll if I get like Charles or Anya or someone like that, because that defeats much of the purpose of doing this. All right, so on my screen, this is asking me for person 7, which is...
Well, Raheem did give a try answer.
Oh, okay. So they get closer to the fitness peak. Okay, so Raheem, can you expand on that? What do you mean by they get closer to the fitness peak?
I have a fan on in the back. Can you hear it?
Yes, we can still hear you just perfectly. Incidentally, you were person number 7 on my screen, so I was going to be calling on you anyway.
Wow.
Well, I'm not really sure, but in the graph you showed us, they were all kind of moving towards one point. So I feel like if they're close to that point, it'll be a little less variation. But I mean, they'll still have variation, of course. They're just
okay. So the idea here being that there's still going to be small changes. Maybe those changes aren't perfectly visible. But this leads into one potential reason why we might say they've stopped evolving. Is that peak going to be in the same place for 3.5 million years?
No, because the environment will change.
No, the environment changes. And the environment is a big component of determining how fit any given thing is. Now, there are some environments that have changed less than others have over long periods of time. notice that a lot of these organisms that we talk about being kind of unchanging for long periods of time either live in the very deep ocean or they live in this intertidal region where there's a constant daily, you get submerged and then you dry out, and you get submerged and then you dry out. Living on that edge of an ocean is an environment that has been physically very similar for very long periods of time. Now, where that ocean is changes over long periods of time. Plates move around, land rises up or falls down, but there's still an edge to ocean and land. And so that's in a physical environment that is going to be fairly consistent over long periods of time. But we also have to deal with, as Raheem brought up, there are small changes in the organisms. What sorts of changes do we actually see in fossil evidence?
Skeletal changes?
Skeletal changes to hard body parts. So we can see a change in skeletons and teeth and maybe even scales and overall shape of an organism. Are we going to see changes in behavior or in color? There are a lot of changes that are just not going to be visible. And then there are also changes that are completely physical, but in things that aren't going to be recorded. So the relative production of particular chemicals, or if they make an enzyme in response to a change in temperature. These are things that don't fossilize. So when we say that an organism has kind of been unchanging for a long period of time, that really only means that the physical structure of the organism looks very similar for long periods of time based on the tiny percentage of them that ever become fossils. And so there are a lot of caveats built into these sentences that are not always explicitly stated. And it's important to try and keep in mind what the actual limitations to the data are. Now, in reality, almost all populations are changing all the time. And that's true not only of these organisms that we refer to as having been these living fossils, but it's also a thing that you'll occasionally see people on the internet talking about how because of modern medicine, humans have stopped evolving. And that's not at all true. We've changed what the selective pressures are. And so there are things that used to be deadly that are much less deadly now. And so more individuals with those variations will survive. But there are many examples of things that are changing rapidly within modern populations of people. It's also a problem that a lot of people will talk about individual organisms being either primitive or well adapted. And so you'll hear people talk about these primitive bacteria that we found in some particular location. Those bacteria have also been evolving for the past 3.8 billion years, as all life has. They are not necessarily analogous to what organisms were 3 billion years ago, just because they have some similarities in the way they make a living. They are still highly adapted. They're just highly adapted to a niche that has been around for a long period of time. All right, next common trap that we want to talk about. So, really common for people to think about the idea that evolution has happened for the good of the species. This was actually a very common sentiment expressed even in scientific research papers back in the 1960s, that people would make arguments about why a particular trait was good for the species as a whole, even if that trait was deleterious to the organisms that carried that trait. And the problem is that that is not the way that evolution works. When a particular trait is harmful to individuals that have that trait, those individuals are less likely to survive or reproduce, and therefore become less common in the population. And organisms will only be self-sacrificial if that sacrifice leads to high enough benefit to other organisms that will either return that sacrifice later on or who are closely genetically related to that individual and therefore likely to spread their genetic information in other ways. So a lot of this got explained in this popular science book by Richard Dawkins about the selfish gene, which I should point out here, we're not talking about a gene that makes you selfish. What we're talking about here is that from the point of view of a chicken's genes, they don't care about the chicken at all. The chicken is a convenient way for that genetic material to get copied into the next generation. The genetic material, to the extent that it has an opinion, which it doesn't because it's a short sequence of nucleotides, but we often talk in these anthropomorphized terms, it benefits from any behavior that increases the frequency of that variant within the population over the course of generations. And so it's important to think about how something can spread, not in terms of whether this is good for the species, not even necessarily whether it's good for the individual organism, but whether it causes the genetic material that induces this change to become more common in the next generation than it was in the previous generation. This is a very technical point, and it took me a lot of words to be able to get that across. So I want to stop here and for a moment and see if you guys have questions, if you feel that needs to be explained in a different way.
Hi, Mike. Could you provide an example of how a gene could maybe harm an individual but hurt the species as a whole? Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I think that's what I understood.
But with Anya looking as excited as she does right now, I'm going to give her the first chance to explain that.
Okay.
So yeah, so for this is like one of the things that I'm really interested in, and like this book actually got me interested in this whole area. I read this in undergrad. I do want to put the caveat that Richard Dawkins is not a great person on other
things. Yeah, he's a terrible person. He's explaining some things.
Yes, so you are welcome to read this book, but do not think that we endorse everything that he says.
We endorse this particular book. Some of his other books are actually bad. This one we agree with.
So a great example is that there are a number of different cases where organisms will actually like commit suicide, like self-destruct, and then provide a benefit to surviving organisms. So there's bacteria that will produce a toxin until they like explode and release that toxin. So they kill themselves, but then that toxin will like kill competitors or will kill a predator or something. I'm using words a little bit generally. And then that lets their surviving relatives do better and produce more offspring. And so since the gene for that behavior is in those relatives, it means that that gene will get passed on, but the individual organism definitely will not be passing on its genes anymore. Does that help at all?
Yes. And
then I want to give an example that is along the same lines, but in a somewhat different direction. So there is this fairly well-studied bacteria that lives inside the cells of a large number of insects. It's referred to as Wolbachia. It gets passed on through the eggs, so it's inherited from the mother, and it's an intracellular parasite. This particular bacteria, because it only gets transmitted through the eggs, tends to force the insects that it infects to produce just daughters. And it does so largely by killing off developing males very, very early on, so that all of the reproductive effort of the infected individual goes into making more daughters, so that way this bacteria is able to spread. The problem is when it becomes too common in the population stops producing males. And so the population can go locally extinct because a population consisting entirely of females in a sexually reproducing species is not going to create another generation. So this particular bacteria can result in its own evolutionary dead end because it can kill off its entire host population. There are quite a number of these examples in a wide variety of different settings. Sometimes they're in these helpful modes, sometimes even without death. So for instance, it's a fairly well-established thing that in a lot of species of birds, individuals from the previous year will often help out at the nest before they go and found their own nest. And so they're foregoing reproduction for a year or maybe even 2 years, but they're helping their parents raise their siblings. And so they're getting variants of their genetic material into the next generation just through their siblings rather than through their offspring. But siblings are closely genetically related to this individual, just like offspring are. So this can be a viable alternative way to getting genetic material into the next generation. Oftentimes, evolutionary biologists will talk about needing to calculate the inclusive fitness of an individual, which is essentially counting up all of the various different individuals that has helped produce or raise, and then multiplying each one of them by the degree of genetic relatedness to the individual you're focusing on. And so there are many ways you can increase your inclusive fitness. You can make it so that you make more offspring, or you make fewer offspring, but they're more likely to survive, or you help your close genetic relatives make more offspring than they otherwise would. There are different ways of getting your genetic variants into the population. You'll notice that I keep referring to your genetic variants, in large part because there are these other misconceptions where you very well may have heard that you and chimpanzees share 98% of your genetic material, which that is true. You've also heard that you share half your genes with your parent, which makes it sound like you are more closely related to a chimpanzee than you are to your parent. And obviously that is not actually true. When we talk about this 50% sharing with parent to child or sibling to sibling, and 25% when you go out to niece and nephew or aunt and uncle, instantly, favorite word here, niece and nephews are combined to be nibblings. It's similar concept to siblings, it's just drop a generation off of it. What these 50% or 25% or 12.5% are referring to is among the positions in the genome that vary from one individual to another. On average, how many of them would you expect to be the same because of the degree of genetic relatedness? All right, I am seeing mostly nodding from the other mentors and blank stares from the participants who have their video on, which is obviously a small subset of the participants, but I am hoping you will flag me down if I am being unclear. All right, next comment trap. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So we've talked a lot about the whole like evolution selecting for altruism, cooperation, like helping your siblings and stuff. We want to be really cautious that you should not apply this to like, this is why humans behave a certain way. Humans' behavior and culture is super complex, and scientists and not scientists get into dangerous territory when they apply these sorts of pretty straightforward and simple concepts of evolution to human behavior and trying to explain human behavior. So you need to be very cautious with that.
also relevant point right here. There is a long-standing issue of people mistaking something being natural for something being good, and something being unnatural for it being bad. This is actually such a well-known thing that it has its own specific terminology. This is referred to as the naturalistic fallacy. Just because something is natural does not make it good or morally acceptable. Just because something is unnatural does not make it bad. Personally, I prefer not drinking water that has been thoroughly contaminated with arsenic, but filtering my water is not exactly a natural process. It's still something that I think is a good idea. There are lots of things that are not directly natural, which are good. There are a lot of things that are natural, which are bad. Please do not mistake something being natural or common among non-human organisms for being an ethical choice among people. At the same point, in general, we can't realistically refer to non-humans as being evil or things like that because they lack moral agency. It's not like this tree is cackling in glee as it chokes out its competitors. It is a tree, it doesn't have moral agency. That does not mean you, as an individual with moral agency, get to do all of the horrible things that nature does. Right. So, another common trap in evolutionary biology, and this is a screenshot from the game Pandemic 2. I didn't get that onto the slide. There is this unfortunate idea that entire species change at once. This is unfortunately ludicrously common in games that attempt to do anything about evolution, where I can go through and say, I want my plague to start causing fever. So I select that mutate button, and now all copies of my plague suddenly create fever. That is not how this works. Individuals, as we said a couple of times before, are the ones that experience mutations. That mutation affects the individual offspring that is created and inherits that mutation. And then maybe it also affects that offspring's future offspring because it gets passed down through the generations. But that doesn't mean that suddenly all the bacteria in the world that are part of this species now start producing a fever. There are differences within populations. There are differences between populations. All right, so we're now getting to the point where I don't have pretty slides prepared because I was honestly making this PowerPoint yesterday and today. So things that I do think are still important to talk about. I have mentioned a few times, and so has Anya, the concept of populations. What do you think we mean when we're referring to a population?
A group of organisms within a species.
It's a group of organisms within a species. These are true. How do we define what that group is? So if I, for instance, were to look at, say, my cats came from this population of cats here in Lansing, and clearly there are also cats in Egypt. Are my cats and the cats in Egypt part of the same population? All right, so Maria in the chat is talking about this as being in their habitat, where they live, and also the resources that they use. And so this is really getting at what we're talking about here. In general, in biology, we refer to populations of organisms as organisms within the same species that are in essentially the same gene pool. They are exchanging their genetic material with other members of the population, and ones that they're not exchanging genetic material with, even potentially, are part of a different population. And there are different ways things can be in different populations. So one of the really obvious ones is that they need to be in a physically similar area. Most organisms are not reproducing due to our extensive reproductive technology that we've developed for medical purposes. So in general, they have to be near each other. It's also helpful if they recognize each other as being part of the same species and that they're reproductively available at the same sort of time. If you have one particular cultivar of flowers that produces its flowers in May, and then someone else has a different cultivar from the same species that produces its flowers in August, those aren't going to be part of the same population, even if they're both in your garden, because they're not producing their pollen at the same time as each other, and therefore they're not able to interbreed. Now, a lot of these concepts of population are very dependent on sexually reproducing organisms. And that is unfortunate because the vast majority of organisms are not actually sexually reproducing, but most of the ones that we can see easily are. And so we tend to mistake everything that goes on with these large, complicated eukaryotic sexual organisms as being what happens for everything, even though they're a tiny subset of biology. So populations can be separated by time, they can be separated by space, they can be separated by behavior, and they can also be separated by slight genetic differences that are simply enough to prevent gene flow. And speciation is itself this really complicated process that there are many, many different definitions of something being in the same species. There are, last time I looked, more than 150 different species concepts that had been defined in the literature. There are probably more since I most recently looked because people invent their own species concepts all the time. The one you are most likely to have heard of in the past is the biological species concept proposed by Ernest Mayr, which is this one that's very much dependent on reproductive ability. Organisms that are capable of producing fertile offspring with each other are members of the same species, and ones that can't are not part of the same species. So, why is this not universal? And there are reasons beyond what I just said, so we're going to see how long it takes you to come up with some additional ones beyond just parroting what I said 2 minutes ago.
Are there certain, I guess, organisms that can reproduce with other organisms that are sort of outside of their species, well, that kind of defeats the whole classification part, but species that don't fit the other types of classification but can reproduce with each other?
Yes, that is one of them. So one of my favorite examples here are with the big cats. So in general, no one is realistically going to give you a hard time if you try and claim that lions and tigers are not the same species. They look different. They typically live in different areas. They look different beyond just like what they physically look like, but if you look at their bones, they have different sorts of behaviors. But if they are held together for long enough periods of time, they will occasionally attempt to reproduce with each other. And in general, if the offspring is male, it's sterile. But if the offspring is female, she is less fertile than either something that's purely a lion or purely a tiger, but she is capable of producing offspring either with a male tiger or with a male lion. So you can actually have gene flow from the population of tigers into the lions or vice versa. Speciation is this long process, and it's not quite completed between these two, but it's close enough that we call it good enough. But there are organisms that we view as different species that are still capable of gene flow.
One important thing to note when you're coming up with ideas for this is that in biology, if an exception is possible, it probably exists.
that is a good statement. Whether or not I know of this exception is a little more complicated, but in general, if you are capable of coming up with an exception, so is nature, and it probably already has. So I'd also talked about how you need to have organisms in the same place, and you need to have them being reproductively available at the same time as each other. What other limitations do we have?
Would age also be a limitation? Because can you not?
So age is a potential limitation here. And one of the ways in which this is a really big limitation, how do I know if my cats are the same species as the farm cats that existed 400 years ago? In general, really hard to tell whether a different species is a different species if they simply existed at different times, because in general, dead organisms are not reproductively accessible, but that doesn't mean they wouldn't have been had they been around at the same time. Now, as Dylan has brought up, we do have this concept of artificial insemination, and so going forward, that's absolutely something we can do, but we tend not to have stored genetic material from hundreds of years ago from a large number of different organisms. We effectively do in some cases. It turns out glaciers are really good at preserving some things. So we could, in theory, check to see whether reindeer from a few thousand years ago are reproductively isolated from modern reindeer if we find enough reindeer carcasses inside ice sheets. But this isn't going to be available for the vast majority of organisms that we try to look at. What else?
Maybe it would help if you repeated the question that you want them to answer.
Okay, what are some other limitations to this biological species concept? What are types of organisms or types of populations that we would not be able to tell whether they're part of the same species or not? All right, I'm going back to my random number generator because I am just like that. All right, this time I come up with 11, and 11 on my screen is Victoria.
I don't know if this is that relevant, but like dogs mostly, or at least domestic dogs mostly, don't look alike, but.
Yeah, so actually domestic dogs are really important for our explanation of some of these things. So there's this accepted concept when dealing with fossil species that you should accept there being as much variation in a fossil species as there is in a modern species, because not all organisms in the species look exactly the same. If you encountered just the bones of a Chihuahua and a Great Dane and a Dachshund, what are the odds that you'd put all three of them in the same species? But we know that they're capable of reproduction. Now, certain pairings are much less plausible than other ones are for a variety of reasons, but they are all still considered to be the same species. And so this sort of thing absolutely causes problems. All right, so I'm going to take a certain amount of pity on you and give you another example of the things we're talking about here. So as I said, these things work well for our large-scale sexually reproducing organisms, and most things are not. If I'm going to require that things be able to produce fertile offspring with each other, how on earth do I determine species when I'm talking about bacteria? Any sort of definition that we have of species is going to run into some groups of organisms that it matters for, and other ones that it doesn't. And strangely enough, even within current existing organisms that are sexually reproductive, we end up with these really complicated edge cases. So for instance, I'm gonna, as I threatened, when I run out of slides, you start seeing me Google. So this is one that I like to bring up here. So these are salamanders on the Pacific coast. We've got them up in Oregon and Washington, and then coming down into California. These different colors here, you don't have to care so much about the specifics of them, but what they refer to is different things that are viewed to be different species within these salamanders. And as these things come to certain geographic boundaries, we run into what I refer to as ring species. So we have this one species up here in the north, and you come to this lake, and you end up with things changing kind of gradually as you go around one side, changing kind of gradually as you go around the other. I'm running into them at the end, and we have this boundary here at one end of that lake where things just to the west and just to the east are unable to reproduce with each other. But populations the entire way around are always able to reproduce with their nearest neighbors. And so there's this gradual gradation from one type to another until eventually they've diverged enough that they're no longer capable of reproducing across a specific boundary, but there's no individual one line we could draw at any other place that says, okay, now everything on one side is one species, everything on the other side is a different species. Things are complicated. This is one of my main take-homes whenever I try and teach anything about biology to a bunch of engineers. Things are complicated, and there are lots and lots of exceptions. All right, so these are most of the major topics that I wanted to get through on our whirlwind of evolutionary thought. I am happy to answer other questions that you guys have. I expect that is also true of several of the other mentors, but if you wanted to leave early, that is also an option. So at this point, we basically want to open things up to questions from you guys.
I also want to emphasize, like, there are no dumb questions. We've gone through and thrown a lot of biology at you, and if you don't have a lot of background in biology, then like there's probably a lot of stuff that we said that didn't actually make sense because we forget. So please, like, ask anything that is unclear. We won't, there's no judgment.
Also, realistically, with a group this size, if there is something that you are unclear of, the odds of you being the only person unclear on it are very, very small. It is much more likely if you ask a question that there are 3 or 4 other people who are wondering the same thing but didn't feel comfortable asking.
Can something be considered a ring species that does not have a place where the adjacent species can't reproduce? Like, I have thought of peregrines as an example, where as far as I know, all of the adjacent peregrines can reproduce, but they don't necessarily reproduce if you skip several adjacent subspecies.
So conceptually, absolutely the same thing. It would end up with a slightly different term because of the way that ring species has been defined, but that does, for instance, happen of across long, relatively linear scales. So for instance, there are species that span the American interchange across the Isthmus of Panama, where the northernmost end and the southernmost end are definitely not capable of reproduction, but they don't run back into each other because they're not actually in a ring. But you do have this continual gradation that there are a variety of different morphologies that show up, and anyone is able to reproduce with their nearest neighbors, but they can't necessarily reproduce with individuals further apart.
Okay, what I was thinking of is slightly different in that it's something that rings, say, tropically around the world as maybe a marine species that's found in the tropics all the way around the globe. And all of the adjacent regions can reproduce. But if you looked at the ones in the Indian Ocean, they may not be able to reproduce with the ones in the Gulf of Mexico or something like that.
I think you would be more likely to find that in the polar regions just because there are land masses that get in the way in the tropics, whereas there aren't so much in the polar regions.
You know, that's why I brought up the peregrine as my first example, is there are subspecies around the world, and I don't know for sure. I guess they don't normally reproduce. They may be able to reproduce if you artificially put them together in a confinement.
I mean,
so I don't know for sure that they can't.
My first introduction to ring species was not with like they rejoin and the two neighbors can't. Like it was with a full all the way around can all breed with neighbors, and then like the two on like the opposite sides of the mountain range can't. So, and it may be that my initial introduction was incorrect, but that was how I had originally learned about them. So.
Yeah, Anya's example is more the way I learned it.
That is the way it's often taught. It's not so much the way it's defined within the literature, which are unfortunately not always identical to each other.
Okay.
So I have a leading question for you, Mike.
Okay.
So when you talked about problems with the species definition, you mentioned that it relied on sexual organisms.
This particular one, yes.
Yes. So for asexual organisms, so when you talk about a bacterial species or a viral species, what does that mean in general?
So depends on which of the species definitions you're using, because there are a bunch of them even within there. Typically, so historically, microbiological species definitions were defined more on biochemical traits. So is capable of using this sugar, is not capable of using this other sugar, is capable of infecting this type of cell, is not capable of infecting this other type of cell. More commonly these days, they're based on genetic distance. And so with bacteria, we tend to use what are referred to as operational taxonomic units, which are abbreviated as OTUs, instead of using the word species. And the degree of genetic similarity we require here is slight technical terms for the people who are more familiar with it, less technical terms for everyone else. We require 97% sequence identity at the 16S RNA. So this is, we require a lot of similarity in the DNA that encodes for ribosomes, because ribosomes are something that literally all organisms have. And if you deviate by very much, it causes real problems, because the ribosome is the thing that makes the proteins in the cell, and the proteins are the things that do basically everything. Now, interestingly, 97% identity at the ribosome level corresponds to roughly 70% genetic sequence identity overall within the genome, and 97% identity in the ribosome means that humans and lemurs are the same species. So how similar something is, and still being in the same species, varies wildly across different branches of life. And so you will often see in talks from biologists about how large of a percentage of things in terms of species are insects. And that's because what it means to be a different species in insect is very different than what it means to be a different species in plants or bacteria or viruses.
And then there's debate of whether we can actually talk about species within viruses, because if they're not alive, then they can't be a species.
Yep. So there are big debates about whether viruses are considered alive or not. And then there are also big debates about whether species are even things and whether we should use this word at all. And the field as a whole goes through cycles of about 20 years between species are really important and we need to define them all clearly versus species are an arbitrary unit that doesn't actually exist and would you all just shut up and stop using the word? And then we cycle back around again. There are good reasons why we do have to use the word species for things other than purely biology. Species are defined as something that matters legally in terms of like the Endangered Species Act. And so for organisms to receive protection from extinction, they have to be classified as species for the most part. And so that means that we have these legal definitions which are different from the biological definitions, but experts in one field are not always experts in the other. And people tend to argue about things that matter in their context and forget that there are other contexts where different rules apply. I think it's important to have a certain degree of intellectual humility and recognize that what you're saying is true in your field is not necessarily universally true for everyone in all fields.
And I'll give people a chance to, the other participants to, a chance to ask more questions, and then I'll ask another leading question if no one else has anything.
Also, feel free to tell me if I didn't get to the answer you were looking for in your leading question.
I wanted you to explore the topic a little exactly like you did. It wasn't a particular answer I was looking for.
I have a question.
Sure.
So during your presentation, you had mentioned that there was a specific type of bird that would, I guess, take a year to help their parents with the offspring. And I don't really have a biology background, so that was very surprising to me because in my experience, it's usually examples of like wolves having cubs and then they just disappear and there's no interaction between the parents and the offspring. So could you give another example of that? And then also you had a term for it. It was like sibling
so the
parents.
term here is referred to as helpers at the nest. It's a term from behavioral ecology, but it comes up again in many other things. Also, because of the specific wording in your question, one thing I wanted to point out here. Wolf pack dynamics. So you have probably heard at some point about the concept of alpha wolves, where you have the dominant male and the dominant female, and they're the ones that reproduce, and the others are the submissive animals. Yeah, that's not how wolves work. Wolf packs in general are an adult male and an adult female and their offspring, which have not yet dispersed. A wolf pack is generally somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 10 individuals, and it's really one mated pair and their offspring. And eventually some of them go on to found their own wolf packs. Wolf biologists have realized the whole concept of alpha thing was wrong since like the 1980s. It was caused by incomplete observations and people having an unfortunate human-centric view of social behavior, which got corrected in the biologists back in the 1980s and has somehow not spread to the general population. So people still talk about alphas and betas and all of that. And that is not a thing even in the field that it came from. But people continue to try to misapply that in biological settings within humans as well. There are a lot of examples of organisms that will actually help out with their parents as they're reaching maturity. This happens in a lot of social species, which includes a very large percentage of birds are at least transiently social in terms of rearing offspring. Almost all birds are what are referred to as socially monogamous in that there is a male and a female that pair together for at least a breeding season to cooperatively raise their young. Some will return to the same partner over multiple years, others don't. And then a large number of the more complex societies among mammals. And so you'll end up with helpers at the nest in terms of wolves and orcas and a number of other dolphin species. You'll get it in some of the group living primates. It also happens to a certain extent within lions. It happens within hyenas. It happens within elephants.
How about naked mole rats?
Naked mole rats are actually even more complicated about that, and they go about halfway in between what you get in primates and what you get in eusocial insect colonies, in that there's actually hormonal suppression of the non-breeding pair within the colony. And so the dominant male and the dominant female will actually produce chemical compounds that inhibit the reproduction of subdominant individuals of the same sex. It's more conclusively demonstrated among females than males, although there's been some evidence of it within the males as well. But these organisms are not actually fully sterile the way that they frequently are in insect societies, and they are often multi-generational descendants of an initial pair from further ago than is true in the other large group living mammals. If you want more examples of this, I will actually point out this is one of those things that Wikipedia is reasonably good at. And so there is this Wikipedia entry of helpers at the nest, and it gives examples of the behavioral ecology and different organisms where this has been demonstrated, and it links to papers demonstrating these things, which is often a good sign for evaluating how realistic this explanation is, because they can give you actual scientific journal articles that demonstrate this.
I want to make one point. The initial study that came up with the alpha wolf stuff, the studies were done on wolves in captivity that were not necessarily related to each other. And so if anybody, and I'm into this because I'm into training dogs, so if anybody wants to talk about alphaness as a dog trainer, you might want to walk away because they do not understand what they're talking about. And I'll plug for Harris hawks and Galapagos hawks as also having helpers at the nest. Showing my own biases. But the wolf study is really so wrong and so artificial and has damaged so many dogs over the years. It's really very sad.
All right, so Dylan had a question in the chat about whether Linnaean classification system is becoming obsolete. And I'm actually going to ask you to expand a little bit on what you mean by the system becoming obsolete, because I can interpret that multiple different ways, and I want to make sure I'm answering what you actually want me to answer. Modern taxonomy. Okay, so the idea here is that Linnaean classification is based on essentially a very large nested tree structure. That we have a couple of different trees. So we have this tree of all animals, and we have this tree of all plants. And within each of them, the very deep nodes are the longest to go separations into different groups, and these separate out into progressively finer scale differences, but we can map the degree of relatedness among them. The original Linnaean classifications were based entirely off of Linnaeus going out and looking at organisms saying, you look more similar to this other organism. So that's probably how it is. It turns out that what an organism looks like is not always a great indication of what its evolutionary history is. There is this entire concept that's referred to as convergent evolution. There are certain physical forms that many different distantly related organisms have converged upon as a good solution to a particular environmental challenge. So one of the common examples of this is that dolphins and sharks have pretty similar body shapes, because it turns out that's a really hydrodynamic body shape. It's a good way to move rapidly through the water. They're pretty distantly related organisms, and they had intervening ancestors that look nothing like that. But because they're in a similar environment, they're being shaped in a similar sort of way. Modern taxonomy is increasingly based on genetic inference. And so taxonomists are looking for groups of organisms that differ from each other by their genetic and evolutionary history. Within the taxonomic community, there is a wide-standing debate on whether certain group names should even exist as a thing. Right now, lots of group names are being reevaluated for legitimate social reasons of, maybe we shouldn't name entire groups of organisms based on horribly racist scientists of the past who happen to be the ones to name them. But beyond simply which names we're using, there's a debate of whether certain names of an entire type of group should even exist. So, for example, we will often refer to reptiles. Well, reptiles include quite a lot of different things, some of which are more closely related to other things that are not reptiles than they do to the other reptiles. So because I mentioned I was going to be showing you a couple of different webcomics, this is the particular XKCD that is most relevant here, where you can see that we talk about reptiles and amphibians being a combined thing, but within reptiles, they're going to be much more closely related to birds and even to mammals than they are to amphibians. There are other reptiles which are more closely related to each other versus some that are more closely related to birds. Which ones are more closely related? Not at all what you'd expect. Lizards are actually further from birds. Birds are closer to alligators because biology is complicated and weird. There are people who try and argue that the only names that should exist are things that define what we refer to as clades. So essentially a clade is an ancestral organism and literally everything that is descended from it and that alone. And that would be a clade of organisms. This results in certain problems. So for instance, dinosaur is not a clade because nested within the group of dinosaurs are birds. There's actually been an increasing move over about the past 7 years at the Big Evolution Conference for people to use the phrase non-avian dinosaurs, so that way they can continue referring to dinosaurs, but make clear that they're not talking about modern parrots. Because the group of organisms that we refer to as dinosaurs are not a clade, because in order for it to be a clade, you'd need their most recent common ancestor and everything descended from it, and modern birds are descended from the most common recent ancestor of all of the rest of the dinosaurs. So this has been one of the big debates in taxonomy. It's been going on for 20 years in kind of argumentative format, and longer ago than that in a little more polite, veiled insult sort of scientific argumentation. I have an opinion on this, but I am also not a taxonomist, and so my opinion is not the most relevant thing here. But this is what's going on in modern taxonomy. A lot of taxonomy is being reevaluated in terms of genetics. There are people who are not happy about that because some taxonomic terms were developed because they were really meaningful in terms of anatomical structure. And the people who study anatomy prefer to use those groupings because they mean something in that field, but they don't necessarily reflect actual evolutionary history.
I have a question.
Sure.
How does, or does it ever, does epigenetics or just gene expression influence the way that organisms are classified ever?
Okay, so first off, explaining what epigenetics means to the general audience. So in general, genetics deals with the differences in the genetic material, so the DNA or RNA that's being passed on. All of those things get modified, and there are controls of which sections of DNA you're even going to use and which ones get silenced, and those things are caused by changes that don't actually change the sequence of the DNA, so the A's, T's, G's, and C's, but do change which ones are even being read and used to make proteins. And that can be inherited as well. So that builds on top of the genetics, so that's referred to as epigenetics. Epigenetics, to the best of my knowledge, has not been used at all in discussions of whether something is or is not the same species. But epigenetic patterns can influence the physical traits that develop. And sometimes those physical traits are things that matter for the ability for organisms to survive or reproduce or attract mates within a population. And so those things can lead to eventual genetic speciation as well, but they are not used in the current classification system to the best of my knowledge.
That makes sense. I was just curious. Thank you.
We're also just about at 4 o'clock, so I want to make sure you guys don't feel any sort of obligation to stick around. If Charles wants to ask me more leading questions, I'm happy to answer them,
Sure.
but do not feel obligated to stick around.
So I'll just jump in with one and then let others, So are humans still evolving?
Yes. This is absolutely true. I can give you lots of individual examples of this. So, for instance, lots of people are lactose intolerant. Most mammals become lactose intolerant when they reach physical maturity. There are at least 3 different origins of the ability for humans to continue digesting lactose even as adults. These are centered on one in the Indus Valley in India, one among the Bantu-speaking peoples of primarily Southern and Eastern Africa, although they've moved around within Africa, and one which seems to have originated in roughly Finland, which is spread throughout most of the European populations. Turns out that winter in Finland is not a great place to get a lot of food, and the ability to survive on milk is useful when you have herds of milk-producing reindeer. This is one example. There are many others. The people who have been living in the Tibetan Plateau for several thousand generations have increased ability to extract oxygen from high atmosphere air. And so they have better endurance and better ability to climb in these conditions. Individuals whose populations have lived in polar regions for several thousand generations actually have different body shape that is better at preserving heat. And they also have different liver function that makes them more able to handle a very meat-heavy diet. So there are physical as well as social and cultural changes that are happening all the time. There are lots of other ones. I can tell you about why it's beneficial to have a wide variety of different skin colors in terms of your actual physical environment. This is also the point to point out that you may have heard recently, and this is something we do need to emphasize, there is no genetic basis of race within humans. There are genetic differences due to continent of ancestry to some extent, that if you look across huge amounts of genetic material, you may be able to predict the percentage of someone's ancestry that may be from one region or another, but there are not clear distinctions and there are not separations the way there are in many other species. Race is a social construct within humans, not a biological concept.
So, I mean, with that, we're a little over time now, so we should probably just plan to wrap up. I know, notice most people have dropped out.
Yep. Feel free to send me questions later on if you need.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. That was great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. Thank you, Mike.
Goodbye.